78, Sir Elton John has decided to break his silence, and the truth he revealed has sent shockwaves through royal circles. Meghan Markle, once shielded by the glitz of celebrity, now finds herself under a harsh spotlight. What did Elton John say that could change everything we thought we knew? Stay tuned, because this revelation will leave you stunned. It all began not with a whisper, by no means inside the great edifice of Buckingham Palace nor on the very streets of London, but in a place even more private, far more regulated than such. Media playback is unsupported on your device. Media caption archive footage of the unveiling of King George VI. The room in question was a small, black and white cottage in Northamptonshire, and the heart beating within it the monarch to follow. It was the kind of whisper that shivers through the silence, and has the feel of something truly dangerous, something meant to be hidden. He is, after all, 78, and at 78, Elton John has seen enough to know that when you hear a whisper, there's a good chance it's not just the hustle of idle chit-chat, it's the first rumble of an earthquake starting. Elton now reveals that this whisper in particular was about Meghan Markle. For decades, Elton has been not merely music, but a talisman, an icon whose storied journey is measured not just in record sales and sell-out tours, but in his deep connections with some of the most powerful, and by necessity the most carefully observed, figures on the planet. His relationship with the former Princess Diana went beyond the purely superficial level of celebrity pleasantries. It was based on trust and loyalty and mutual understanding of life under constant public scrutiny. And this bond extended in different directions to her sons, William and Harry. It was his friendship which made him such an unique intermediary between the court and the world of celebrity. Before we start, please smash that like button, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for videos. But it is this connection and those who might cross it that bring us to the moment that would then rock him to his very core, because Elton himself claims that Meghan Markle allegedly tried to exploit his influence to spread stories in the media. Never mind the harmless press releases, the puff-piece profiles, the factually shaky stories that could harm the images of senior royals, all while keeping hers pristine. When he heard of it, he felt no anger. He was mature enough to keep his sense of balance. His experiences in life and the entertainment business had introduced him to virtually every kind of human ambition. But this was a different situation, though. This was no dreamy wannabe singer, no aspiring actor hungry for a chance. This was a man sitting inside one of the world's most stable and carefully groomed institutions whose ostensible message was, "Jack, fan the flames of a firestorm for us, would you?" Why had she come for him? Even now, that question lingers. Elton wasn't a hack and nor was he PR, but he had much more powerful leverage, a bulging list of contacts in showbiz and news, and a reputation so unsullied that few would question his motivations. A call to the right party at the right publication would not have produced suspicions, but kudos. However, if such detrimental narrative about a member of the royal family came from someone like him, it would hardly be seen as a leak but as a fully corroborated truth. Maybe that was exactly why she allegedly reached out to him. The sequence of events is the key here. By the time of this supposed request, Meghan was extremely familiar with the pitfalls of royal life. Indeed, the idealized image she painted for herself in her engagement interviews had been chipped away by the sheer force of tabloid attention, the working of the internal palace machine and unhappy family relations. Both she and Harry were the targets of vehement media criticism, with their camps often accusing palace officials of failing to protect them, and even colluding with the media, as they faced near constant negative coverage. Controlling the story was not an option, but essential to their existence. He had long been used to the harmful effects of media narratives, having battled British tabloids for years for publishing false claims about his personal life. He had filed suits, settled cases, and railed against intrusive journalism. Paradoxically, he was acutely aware that information could be strategically deployed to shape perceptions. Meghan probably recognized he was a man who understood the depression to which the press can sink and its power to revise reality. The actual conversation was probably muted and practical. In contrast to his flamboyance at the piano, those who knew Elton described him offstage as blunt, deliberate and cautious in what he says. Meghan, too, was shown as deliberate in private, minding her language and always kind of cloaking radicalism in rationalism. One can look at the request not as talking smack but as defensively lobbing the first shot across the rim, getting the record straight before others did it for her. Elton now admits that there was a message behind the performance that was not so subtle. He was to plant stories about certain senior royals through friendly contacts, making sure to not mention her, so the heat would be taken off of her. Such tactics, standard fare in politics and widely regarded as fair game in the entertainment world, are risky for the royal family. For Elton, his decision was about more than just showing loyalty to the royals or Meghan, it was about protecting his legacy. Now 78, with a career that's in its sixth decade, every step he takes will help frame his legacy. Would he ever trash-talk former friends in the press and risk his reputation that way? Would he throw away the trust built up over decades for an act of political friendship? And there's a personal element to keep in mind, too. Elton's relationship with Harry was more than ceremonial. He had previously voiced public support of the couple, extending a show of solidarity against the media's attention. And it was this history that added up to the perfect choice for Meghan's purported inquiry. If Elton was publicly endorsing them in the past, it wasn't entirely implausible to imagine him as a covert communications channel for Meghan's own complaints. But Elton later admitted that there's a delicate balance between holding the line against injustice and helping someone who's embattled and underground. Crossing that line, he suggested, could have dire consequences. Bailey's ponderous silence, and as the implied desire hung on the air, Elton realized its import. It meant descending into a world where the stakes were not a few articles and headlines, but reputations and futures. A damaging narrative could last for generations in the royal realm. One story, regardless of whether or not it is true, could define a person in the mind of millions forever. The dangers were both heavy and far-reaching to future generations. The sheer fact that Meghan would ever stand in his way like that, and he made the choice to reveal it, says everything about the climate behind the scenes in the family at that moment. Trust was in short supply, alliances were constantly reforged, and the battle between official palace narratives and unauthorized leaks was intensifying. To outsiders looking in, the royal family may seem like a sealed fortress. It could be a checkerboard where everyone's next move is studied carefully and every piece is expendable. And for Elton, the request represented a risk of another kind. If it ever saw the light of day, Meghan wouldn't be the only one in the hot seat. His name and his credibility could all be called into question. Is he a loyal friend maintaining the memories of Diana, or a man prepared to betray her family for personal reasons? The idea that his lifelong association with the royals had been smeared by scandal and salacious headlines must have hung heavy on him during the following months and years. Elton kept mostly mum about the alleged encounter, but silence does not equal neglect. But eventually, either through age, or thinking about what he'd said, or changing public opinion, he decided to put into words what he had said and why. The effects of this choice would extend well beyond the world of celebrity tattle, and would ignite a serious debate on the nature of truth and loyalty and the fragile line between self-protection and doing harm to others. More than just a story of Elton John and Meghan Markle. It also tackles the subject of influence: who has it, how is it used, and the moral questions at stake if one has to use it. It delves into the dangerous space in which all too intimate a world met up with all too public aspirations and anxieties, and the iron grip of dumb publicity had on our fragile psyches. If and when Elton decided to tell those stories, he was well aware of the risks, and exactly he was brave enough to front them. Long before Meghan Markle had her place in the royal firmament, long before there were rumors of leaks and secret agendas, Elton John had carved out a singular niche in the British monarchy. His was not a transactional or a decorative marriage, but rather a bond more unusual among royals, an authentic, present friendship. To understand why his views matter where royal matters are concerned, we need to go back. Back to a time before Diana Spencer became the global icon she would go on to be. Elton had first encountered her in the early 1980s, not in some shimmering ball or plush reception, but at a charity do, when the worlds of royalty and fame collided in the most unexpected of ways. It was clear to everyone who was there that they had an instant connection. She'd been captivated by his humor, and he loved her warmth and ability to make everyone feel comfortable, whatever their position. Their bond quickly developed into one of the most famous royal celebrity romances of the 20th century. Through the blossoming of confidence in each other came scenes of comfort during gang rape trauma and the outgrowing of newly developed understanding in the most unexpected way for someone like Diana. Elton wasn't just a public figure in her own circle, he was a refuge, a person to whom she could confide without worrying that her words would turn up somewhere in the tabloids. This bedrock of trust proved crucial at later times, particularly when Diana felt isolated within the palace walls. Although betrayed throughout her marriage to Prince Charles and pelted with relentless criticism from the media, Elton was one of the few steadfast presences in her life. Never did he run to the press or capitalize on her misfortune, only to defend her while others remained silent. This loyalty was mutual. Diana turned out in force to support her friend's own philanthropy, most notably his pioneering AIDS Foundation. They were seen out on the charity circuit using their status as a couple to discreetly shift the news focus away from stories that the media had been all too happy to report on when they involved fingers in other people's marriages. But their relationship was more than merely on the surface, it went for a personal level. Elton was also there for Diana when she needed a friend to help break away from the confines of palace life. When Princess Diana died in 1997, Elton John was truly and genuinely mourning her death. His poignant delivery of Candle in the Wind at her funeral brought tears to the eyes of millions and is one of those major television moments that people remember. There were no cameras flashing and no fans screaming for Elton. This was an emotional performance not about the limelight but about saying goodbye to a friend and expressing his emotions through the power of music. The lasting sight of Elton at the piano inside Westminster Abbey, his voice laden with grief, yet unmistakable resolve, is an image that will be imprinted on the minds of millions. In the wake of that emotional moment, the dynamics of Elton John's ties to the royal family began to transform. Even though he was not in fact officially linked to them, he became linked to them, eternally, in the public's estimation, on account of his moving tribute to Princess Diana. Elton was no longer just Elton the musician, he was the man who'd been there for Diana when she needed him most, the man who'd carried himself and paid tribute to her with dignity and sincerity. This connection naturally extended to Diana's own sons, Prince William and Prince Harry. In recent years, after their mother's death, he'd been a stable and ever-present part of their lives. He continued to support them financially through generous donations, provided them with sanctuary from the all-consuming press, and, despite the changing tides of royal affairs, always spoke of them with profound respect, demonstrating his steadfast loyalty. When Prince William married Catherine Middleton in 2011, Elton and David Furnish were among the guests of honor. As proof that he is, an actual member of the royal circle, built over a foundation of trust that spans decades. But it was his unique bond with Prince Harry that held the most significance in terms of Meghan Markle. The pair shared a close friendship with both working together on causes such as HIV/AIDS awareness and mental health. Harry often signed his praise to Elton's life-changing influence and amazing generosity. Elton, meanwhile, praised Harry for continuing his mother Diana's compassionate nature following Meghan's introduction into his and Harry's lives. Showing his unwavering support, Elton warmly welcomed the couple to his home in the south of France and defended them against scathing backlash. Very little of Elton's television work features quite such direct defenses of public figures. His outspokenness, even in the face of criticism, makes his voice even more important when he does weigh in. It is this characteristic that made Meghan's alleged ask stand out. She did come to him about this idea of planting these stories. She regarded him as not only a trusted friend of the family but as one to be lured with a public defense magnified and a private power yielded. By the time Meghan and Harry withdrew from royal duties in 2020, Elton's throne was unassailable. He had a long association with the institution, was a close friend of both of Diana's sons and was an influential figure on the international stage who could serve public opinion. Elton was beloved by the British public, worshipped by fans, and considered an honorary guardian of Diana's memory. This made him a pliable friend, but also, depending on where his ultimate loyalties lay, a dangerous one. For Meghan, who often felt stifled or misconstrued by the palace, a figure like Elton could provide the discreet and highly effective type of support she was looking for. He was the person that the royal family could trust to handle the more prickly areas of the story without contributing to it. And this trust equation is what made the purported conversation so combustible. In hindsight, Elton was one of the handful of people who could straddle that gap between the UK royal family and the international superstar world. Without wanting to sound crass, nothing good was going to come toward him from helping Meghan, and not just that, but he could lose everything if it all went tits up. So when you hear about that royal-Elton relationship, it's more than just mutual respect and occasional dinner invitations. It reflects decades of loyalty forged through moments of public triumph and private sorrow. For this man had had a unique view of the palace, not from inside as a resident, but as a confidant. He understood that the riskiest fights are rarely between armies, but rather between stories. Here, though, Meghan's tidbit train is more than just gossiping, it's inviting people to play a game Elton has successfully avoided for too long. So when Elton did ultimately choose to speak out decades after he had his first encounters with the royal family, the impact was automatically rooted in history. It wasn't someone else's voice out of left field, it was the sound of someone who had been in the room during somber, private hours, when the cameras were gone. He knew what true loyalty was and what it cost. When Meghan Markle became Prince Harry's new girlfriend, the press went into overdrive, and, as usual, it was anything but complimentary to the woman involved. The coverage was initially breathless, inquisitive, celebratory, all about how the glamorous American actress would fit into the royal family. Yet behind the palace walls, the attention brought its own stresses. The royal family knew full well that the honeymoon period wouldn't last forever, and when the pendulum swung in the other direction, and it will, they didn't want to be caught off guard. It was in this world of tentative introductions and hushed appraisals that Meghan first entered Elton John's orbit. For Elton and those like him, meeting new faces in royal circles was a regular part of life over the years. He counted many members, attendants, and hangers-on among the family, and from them issued that web of relationships that palpably veiled the working of all court intrigue. But Meghan is different, not just in terms of her professional expertise or nationality, but in the pace in which she learned and then yearned to tread the fine line between appearance and reality, the public veneer and personal truths. With the first megalosaur, the conversation was pleasant and friendly. Meghan had supposedly been a big fan of Elton's for years, both for his music and his outspoken support and continued friendship with her late mother-in-law, Princess Diana. For her, it was not just a brush with celebrity, it was an encounter with a man who had once been closely associated with the woman whose memory she and Harry so frequently invoked as a guiding example. Meghan's charisma was unmistakable. She was articulate, engaging, and sincerely interested in his charitable projects. One of the first big encounters between Meghan, Harry, and Elton happened in privacy, away from the media's gaze. It was a small gathering, a mix of high society and true intimacy, the kind of place where celebrities and nobility share a table without the presence of cameras or publicists. Here was Meghan's natural grace and an ability to make a friend. She asked about Elton's AIDS Foundation, listened closely to his stories of working with Diana on awareness campaigns, and talked of her own hopes to use her celebrity status to help humanitarian causes across the world. There was an implied meaning under all their polite exchanges. Meghan wasn't just talking to Elton John the singer but to Elton John the socialite. He occupied a singular point of influence in Meghan's orbit as a result of his personal ties to the royal family. This was an important influence at the time. Not long after, Elton extended an invitation to Harry and Meghan to visit his home in the south of France. This was an act not just of friendship but of solidarity. Now the couple were under increased media spotlight, following criticism which ranged from attacks on Meghan's choice of clothes, style of royal duties, and even her family background. The south of France offered some protection with minimal paparazzi harassment so they could relax among trusted friends. But this visit itself became the subject of a slight scandal when it was revealed that the couple had flown there on a private jet. The press, however, latched on to this perceived hypocrisy despite their commitment to the environment. Elton became an advocate for them in public, noting that their private flight was for security reasons and that he had 100% carbon offset the emissions. He was solid but also measured in his response, which underlined the fact that he was ready to fight for Harry and Meghan, when need be. During this period, Meghan's relationship with the British press became more adversarial. The good storytelling subsided, and the bad storytelling took over. The couple began to sense that palace staff were not defending them enough and began to suspect that negative stories were being leaked into that environment deliberately. Allies outside the palace became suddenly more important, and very few had the respect, attention, and credibility in the eyes of the public that Elton John had. And Meghan was depicted deepening that relationship with Elton as a part of the natural progression of his friendship with Diana and her two sons. To those watching closely, however, it was clear that this relationship could have multiple benefits for both parties. To Meghan, Elton represented not only an emotional support, but also strategic significance. For the majority of his life, supporting Meghan meant also supporting Harry. And Elton's embrace of Meghan was not just because of Harry, it should be pointed out. It's been reported that Meghan expressed a desire to get on well with him. Meghan asked him about his life, family and charity work to make herself seem compatible with him either way, because she shared his values, especially in the regard of philanthropy and social justice. This alignment, whether purely authentic or partly tactical, brought Elton around to the idea of her as an ally worth a damn. But as I got to know them, the relationship became more complicated. Meghan was in a delicate position. As a newcomer to the royal family, she was in the process of figuring out her position in the firm, but also young and someone who understood how the power of public narrative shaped her future. Her work in the entertainment business had already taught her how one media story could change the direction of a public figure. Hollywood had long been about spinning tales, shaping stories, and juggling reputations. In the bed of kings, danger lay just under the surface and was never far. This was not a strange place for Elton. He had seen Princess Diana push back against the media, sometimes turning it to her advantage, sometimes becoming a victim of its force. A quicksilver change of public opinion, the value of perception rather than the truth, were lessons he had absorbed thoroughly. Against this turbulent milieu, the rumored, and latterly publicized, request of Meghan's took on even greater gravitas. By the time they had this conversation, Meghan and Elton were anything but a couple of passing platonic acquaintances. They shared experiences and mutual friends had built a trust between them. As someone who had been a guest in Elton's home and had his public backing, like Elton, Meghan both understood and experienced the punishing life under constant media focus. What were the scenes right before we saw that key conversation were such nuanced and, you say, chilling moments? Meghan hinted at her frustrations with certain members of the royal family, always careful to cast it as in her own self-protection rather than out of ill will. Sharing her wish to tell her own story to the world and not have it written by others, Meghan saw a kindred spirit with Elton in the fight for independence. Elton told her it was easy for him to understand that, but that such empathy wasn't the same as empathetic action. By the time Meghan had felt comfortable enough to ask, reportedly, Elton had gathered enough information about what to expect regarding royal life and could imagine the ramifications. Meghan didn't want a public endorsement that could have been twisted as fealty to friends. What she wanted, ostensibly, was more furtive, to quietly pass on information to media contacts who might be able to spin it in ways that would be potentially damaging to certain senior members of the royal family without her fingerprints being all over it. In Meghan's mind, this could be seen as a means of protecting herself by deflecting attention from her and Harry onto themselves. Elton, however, saw it as a gamble with potentially lifelong effects. Key to that stage of the relationship, the mixture of actual friendship and tacit strategic openings. Meghan didn't just happen to bump into Elton. She had crossed his path at the very moment when she was vulnerable but also ambitious, and was seeking powerful allies who could help her through, if not control, the media world. Elton, for all his experience and prudence, would still have to decide whether to remain simply a sympathetic ear and friend or to begin to exert his considerable influence to alter the balance of power in the royal family. The solution to this conundrum would soon become evident. In those early days, on the surface at least, their relationship was based on respect and shared values behind the scenes. No matter, the foundation, more intricate and menacing, that would lead to a complicated relationship was already starting to take form, far from red carpets, charity dinners or anywhere that would betray the cracks other than under dusk-like artificial lights supplied by flashes of cameras. The bombshell conversation that would eventually leave Elton John's strictly confidential relationship with the royal family in tatters took place in an unimpressive location, not designed to be grand, but for discretion and protection from exposure. The place had the warm glow of soft lighting and everything was cast in this golden sheen. It could have been one of Elton's personal homes, a combination of comfort and decorum, or a private, unobtrusive lounge where the rich, powerful, and royal come to be discreetly unbothered. The mysteries in the location, which Elton has never really disclosed in full. What he would share, however, is that it was a somber and noticed gathering that included only him, Meghan, and Harry. Surprisingly, it was actually Meghan who led the charge to steering the conversation into the territory of personal slights lacing with strategic maneuverings. At the root was Meghan's outreaching compassion, rage against the media's brutality, its need to inflict real pain for stories, and its need to dumb down issues. Having faced similar struggles himself, Elton listened intently as Meghan discussed the difficulties she had faced, steering the discussion in a more purposeful and intense direction. Meghan then started naming members of the royal family, not in general terms, but with specific details. She mentioned things that had happened, private remarks and relationships involving people who, if they were publicly identified in news reports, would look terrible. At first she presented it as context and background, an explanation of why she feels the way she does, but over time, on purpose, the story changed. And then, almost offhandedly, she suggested that a few truths bursting to the surface, sure, that could be helpful, though, of course, not if they were exploded into the public sphere by her and her alone, as that would be too obvious. What if, instead, she made it so the news could quietly circulate within the media world, spreading quietly and discreetly, so that the public's idea of the royals would change from figures untouchable and venerable to people possibly flawed, maybe unkind. Meghan's word choice was careful. You could make even the most daring suggestion seem reasonable and even moral. She wouldn't call it leaking, instead, she referred to it as setting the record straight. Instead of calling it attacking, she talked about self-defense and making sure people knew the full story, as if the idea were entirely ordinary. She referred to Elton's connections. Funny had contacts, respected journalists, editors, broadcasters who gladly took his calls. If he told a story, it wouldn't occur to them to challenge its veracity since it was coming from someone, like him, whom they trusted. If it were Elton John, you can be sure they would publish it and not ask too many questions about where it came from. Elton recalled Elton handing him papers or trading direct quotes. This was no mere information, it was a proposition. a proposition about how to use his legitimacy in a way that wouldn't be traced back to her. Harry, however, continued in conversation but little. According to Elton, one of the most striking things about that moment was the lack of dissent from Harry. He couldn't tell if it was from embarrassment, concordance, or just an unwillingness to interrupt. Still, Harry's failure to object provided Meghan's suggestion with a whispered stamp of approval, or at the very least a nod to the idea Harry would be willing to sanction the road Meghan was hinting at. Elton, there sitting, felt the importance of it, and made his escape as soon as he could after his arrival. Even though it was kind of him to transfer information to someone who might publicize it, he said, he understood, this was getting serious. In royal world, the media are not just an audience but an active weapon. If expended, its effect cannot be undone. Tentatively, he asked what the fallout might be if these stories broke. Meghan didn't hesitate. She talked about the idea of equilibrium, questioning why it had been so easy for the palace and its allies to create channels through which they could push damaging narratives about her and Harry. It was only just that the public be further informed. Not revenge but balance was what they wanted. But Elton felt the delicate edge about it. The allusions were far from innocent commentaries and insinuated accusations, some covert, others blatant. They burst onto the media scene like a flash flood, without even the pretense of subtlety. These stories did not pass away, they became part of the royal characters. Involved and shaped attitudes permanently. Remembering Diana, Elton also thought about the fact that she had played the press at times and, yet, he also saw how the press had turned against her. It was beyond anyone's control. As he pondered the years of refusing to interfere in palace business, he remembered the unspoken promises taken at her funeral, unstated oaths to protect her sons and maintain the confidence she had placed in him. And then there was Meghan, encouraging him to go beyond that barrier, not to protect Harry and William but to hurt others so she could save herself. Elton did not fly into rages, that was not his way with private tension. Rather, he sat back and listened closely, asking a few strategic questions and letting the requests hang there. He didn't accept or reject them either. An instant no in these cases may forever close a door that an immediate yes opens and can never be shut. But in his heart he already knew his answer. He could not, would not, consent to do her proposal. It was not that he did not know or understand the obstacles she faced. On the contrary, he understood them more than most. It was not because he did not understand the outcome. He'd seen reputations ruined, relationships destroyed, families wrecked over a whole lot less. The conversation then drifted to less volatile topics, charity work, mutual friends, future projects, but an awkwardness remained. Elton left that meeting with a burden he couldn't shake. It wasn't the first time he'd been asked to use his influence on behalf of someone else, but it was the first time the request originated from so near the heart of the empire, with the potential to cause so much damage. He thought a great deal about it during the next few days. More often than not, he reminded himself to consider what he could accomplish with his answer to any of a dozen questions, which contacts he could use, what rumors he could spread without blighting Meghan. He wondered about the consequences of a no, the tension he could cause between himself and Harry, the risk of Meghan seeing him as yet another difficult person. In the end, it was more than friendship weighed for Lena. It was about the life he'd built, the faith he'd honored, and knowing that there was no emerging from palace persuasion without getting dirty. He sensed, correctly, as it turned out, that Meghan understood the game she was playing. He didn't know whether she thought of it as a game. For Elton, the instructions were crystal clear. Some lines that are crossed, once crossed, change not only your relationships, but your own story of you, the narrative you tell to yourself about who you are. Accordingly, without fuss, and without ceremony or dispute, he took his side. The story wasn't going to come from him, the phone calls wouldn't be made. He suppressed the example secretly for a while. Just another memory in a life filled with extraordinary experiences. What he doesn't know yet, what will come years into his career, deep into his own thoughts about loyalty and truth, is that he will unlock that sealed door decades later and show the world the scene in that brightly lit room. But the British royal family has survived for centuries not only because of its lineage, wealth, or decorative role, but rather for its ability to maintain appearances. It is that persona, refined, controlled, even conservative, and full of tradition, that has been as important to its survival as its origin in the modern world. Protecting that image has required not only public appearances and official pronouncements, but also a ceaseless, secret management of perception behind the scenes. Palace PR is not a part-time gig. It is a full-time undertaking. From the second the public is introduced to a new family member, everything they say, every move they make, becomes a cog in the Byzantine narrative machine that is press departments, sees, media alliances, and carefully cultivated relationships with journalists. The family knows the fickle nature of this popularity and objects to it. Striking a balance between tradition and flexibility is important and hard. The royal family has to keep a balance of being relatable but dignified, human and yet pristine from the complexity of everyday life. They even admit to personal trials, but are careful not to open any holes in their facade. To maintain this veil of secrecy, the palace controls communication, information, and when and where news is revealed. But the unsettled media environment of 24/7 news cycles, the internet and social platforms presents an increasing threat to their grip. A lone misstep or leak can race around the world in nothing flat, frequently outstripping the palace's own response time. In the palace walls, there is an unspoken acceptance of the transactional relationship with the press. Leaks are calibrated to produce news, redirect attention, or control the narrative, even though government officials insist they do not directly sponsor such tactics. It's a dynamic that has long been part of the system, offering both shelter and exposure to every member of the royal family. You have controlled access, you have friends in the media, and you have a pre-existing narrative, and all of that is your protective bubble, Shapiro said, adding that the protective bubble can be punctured by internal fights, personal missteps, or strategic choices. The loyalty of the palace is to the crown, not to any individual member, so even senior royals become a target of unwanted media attention if it is deemed to serve the interests of the institution. All of which brings us to the more fragile state of the royal family. In periods of internal strife, the palace's PR strategy could shift slightly, favoring the saving of one person's reputation over another. Petty negative news could quietly leak to distract from more harmful stories elsewhere. It's a harsh realization for someone like Meghan Markle, who arrived in this world both a newcomer and an internationally known celebrity, that the palace might let negative tabloid press fester or even play a role in disseminating it. Unlike the aggressive, personal dynamics of reputation management in Hollywood, the palace's approach is more expansive, the institution above all, even if it means a step back for an individual royal. It was nothing new from Elton John's POV. That is what he had seen happen to Princess Diana. Even as Diana became world famous, she was speaking out, speaking up, and people at the palace would sometimes let damaging stories, and sometimes actively fan the flames, about her personal life fester. Her rocky relationship with the media provided a warning tale to anyone who thought they could ever truly dominate the press. This is why Meghan's reported attempt to win Elton over was a dangerous gambit in royal public relations. When a senior member of the royal family, or a relative such as a newcomer from the outside through marriage, is believed to be behind the engineering of bad stories about others in the institution of the family, that, to the establishment, spoils its whole dynamic. The media feasts on controversies. It's like a shark, one finds the scent of blood and the next thing is little can satisfy its hunger. This fragile balance is further upset when leaks come from areas beyond the formal palace lines. Palace insiders may collude in their own media operations, but those are negotiated transactions that are based on mutuality of interest and the lifelong prospects of the monarchy. The source of an external leak, let alone a malicious one, is very hard to guess. it can spin out of the palace's ability to control it. For Elton, who has existed on the periphery of this world for decades, the implications were clear as day. In the event of even general exposure to such a leak, which the palace could not only see as a betrayal by Meghan, but a betrayal by Elton for the women's relentless proving of their friendship to one another. A friend of Diana's, a man who was careful never to become directly embroiled in the royal household. Oddly enough, the public image of the royal family has always been about artifice. The photos are posed, the interviews scripted, everything is artfully arranged to accentuate some things and play down others. Yet the system is still fragile. All it takes is one unauthorized story, one external voice, and the system immediately goes into a defensive circle, not allowing the damage to escape. That is why positive stories are just as important as the balance of risks. Every event, statement, story gets as much approval as it does for the possibility of damage. But not since Meghan and Harry have such strong lateral channels confronted. The palace. It had no one to respond to other than a dissatisfied employee or distant relative. Meghan and Harry could make global headlines with the snap of their fingers, and the palace had no idea how to stop them. In this sense, the story about Elton, confirmed by no one but the anonymous sources, is especially significant. For Meghan, it was the only way of making sure her point of view gets heard. For Elton, this was a new level of informality, which could equate to a significant risk. He had been living under this system all his life, and even though it is imperfect, it has its meaning of life, which thinners. Should not challenge. This system is also tied to the perception of the people. British people love monarchy with the same skepticism they feel about it and grow in their need to see behind the curtains. They accept some scandals, but family squabbling can break their last image. The palace understands it, and the people who had been there for a long time understand it. Elton understood as well. He saw how the country turned into a mob and decided it was too dangerous. The last thing he needed was for the bloody newspapers to call him out for disrupting one of the oldest systems. Still, the balance was breaking. Meghan and Harry's attempts to solve this issue on their own, the palace response that was late in any case, the need of the bloodthirsty media on all sides all showed that one story might change everything. Elton watched the threads come loose, realizing their importance. Knowing the delicate stuff out of which royal history was made, he knew that little matters prepare the way always for the big. In the fragile ecosystem of royal PR, one conversation or choice could mean the difference between composure and chaos. There are defining moments throughout your life where you can take a path that not only defines your next chapter but affects everything you have painstakingly built, something Elton John well understands. One of those final moments came in the form of the inescapable appeal of Meghan Markle. That went beyond merely repeating the gossip, it cut to his core, to the values that define him, to the delicate web of trust that he had painstakingly cultivated over decades in the public eye. Although the answer might seem simple, refuse. But in the shady universe Elton inhabited, nothing about the royal family was ever straightforward. To rebuff a plea from someone like Meghan posed risks beyond personal acrimony. It risked rejection by a community that, for nearly 4 decades, had become inextricable from his life. But agreeing to the plea came with still greater risks. At the heart of the predicament was loyalty. The bond between Elton and Diana had deepened in the maelstrom of non-stop public scrutiny. He had stood by her when she felt alienated in the institution she represented. Of course, that loyalty extended to her sons. He'd swore he'd watch over them, in his own, special manner, to be a shining example of stability and truth. In a place where those sorts of ideals were an oddity, helping Meghan, in the abstract sense at least, could perhaps be considered the logical continuation of that effort. And if she felt trapped, as Harry's spouse and the mother of his children, couldn't a friend help her? But there was a second oath that Elton had made to himself long ago, and that he had religiously kept for many years, always abstain from being a pawn in palace power games. He had seen too many people destroy themselves through this kind of politics. It was a world where friends could become enemies overnight, where favors carried undisclosed prices, where truth itself was a casualty of self-interest. He was also a shrewd operator when it came to leaks, especially in the entertainment industry. Spreading the word needn't be worse than an innuendo. The source described almost openly, but known to all. Inside the royal bubble, the risks were compounded. The wrong word to the wrong journalist might set off a cascade, with hostile publications unearthing past vendettas, reviving former alliances and reconfiguring strategy in unpredictable ways. Click here, there was no taking a story back once it hit the streets. When Elton reflected upon the application that was made to him, the consequences that really followed from it, the hopes it raised, the extinction that seemed to threaten his late father's name, the indignity that must have been his inheritors, he could not on any account, give the approbation that was required. If he agreed, and any of this broke, the palace would surely order an investigation into the source of the leak. Whether the palace found direct evidence or not, that hardly mattered at this point. They could deduce where it came from by attaching it to Meghan. His name would ever be connected with the act, and his loyalty was publicly imputed by many to the crown alone. If he refused, he faced disappointing Harry and alienating Meghan, and, in their time of crisis, being seen by them as less than supportive. It was on his mind. Having been spurned and betrayed before himself, Elton had somehow managed to avoid visiting that pain on those he cared for. Thinking about the decision got to be an all-encompassing obsession in the days that followed. It ran through his head in lulls when he was practicing piano, and seemed to sit in plain sight at the edge of their discussions, even those in which the topic was unconnected to David. He told few others about the request, knowing that the fewer people in the know, the less chance there was for things to leak. But the handful of trusted people he confided in, who had been confronted with the same ethical quandary, all warned against it. A warning trembled into his thoughts, crossed the line, and there is no going back. The backlash to Diana's unauthorized 1995 Panorama interview, in which she dodged palace protocols, was a case in point. While widely seen as a brave moment of candor, the fallout within the royal family was fast and fierce. Bridges were burned irreparably. This was the warning: the temptation of rationalizing protocol infractions carries with it its own penalties. A friend emphasized a certain truth Elton had been more than aware of: his stuff was being looked at through a lens of celebrity and influence, because that is what he was presented as daily in the press. If news of his being part of a leak ever did come to be, the focus wouldn't be Meghan's gripes or whether or not the story is true, but on his betrayal of the British institution and the woman who most needed its support. Instead, the focus would instantly turn to him. The headlines would scream betrayal. The tabloids would dredge up every past association he had with royalty, and his reputation would be rebranded under a cloud of scandal. And this dilemma was the essence of his moral dilemma. Acceding to Meghan's request would mean violating the principles he himself had long stood up for, whereas refusing could damage established relationships. He loved them both fraught with the possibility of failure and lacking in any guaranteed conclusion. In the end, Elton reflected on the larger implications he'd based his career and reputation around: authenticity. And he had to be, because that authenticity was what people trusted him to convey. They trusted him to never flinch, never shirk, never carelessly snap the end off some particular brand of trust stick. Faith in his fans lay in his being a champion of friendships, not likely to be easily turned to others' cravings. Giving in at this time risks changing that perception forever. Complicating matters, the governor is 78, on the verge of his legacy. Elton knew perfectly well that history had a way of casting people in stone forever. The scripting of the last chapters of his life would be most unforgettable. He hoped those chapters wouldn't be framed by palace drama or petty vengeance. Instead, he hoped they'd concentrate on music, charity, and the causes he'd spent years vigorously championing. In quiet times, Elton would replay his conversation with Meghan over and over again in his mind, analyzing every word, every hesitation, every look. Was she asking out of desperation or out of a deliberate strategy? Was this about her own protection, or was it about changing the narrative surrounding the royal narrative in her favor? The reality it turned out he suspected was somewhere in the middle. But what disturbed him the most was Harry's quietness in their talk. Maybe the moral decision-making process would have been easier if Harry had been for it or against it. But Harry said so little it was difficult to know which way he felt about it, and whether he was being secretly tested. Finally, Elton came to a realization that would inform his answer. Real friendship does not require blind obedience. Preventing a mistake is sometimes the best thing a true friend can do to help someone. It was a principle he had applied during his own recovery from addiction, when the real friends were the ones who delivered the hard truths, he has said. He ultimately decided not to follow through on Meghan's request. He wouldn't be able to make calls, pass information or campaign against other royal family members. Yet, he also decided not to call her out so much as to permanently cut the cord. He would refuse, though not wordily, for by doing nothing he'd say what needed to be said. This was not a decision that came without consequences. Their warmth towards one another seemed to taper off with time. The invitations tapered, the communication erratic. Elton took this as the price of integrity. He had chosen the harder of the two roads, the one that preserved his personal integrity at the possible cost of both friendship and love. Until now he kept the story to himself, not because it frightened him, but because he knew that some truths should only be uttered when the time is right. It would be years before he felt it was the right time to come out with what really happened. When he did discuss the events at last, it was not to get his own back but in a spirit of speaking frankly about the difficulties and the sacrifices of a royal life. He told me that although his moral problem was resolved, he was still haunted by the memory. It was, implicitly, a reminder that with great power comes great responsibility, and that sometimes the most potent draft of it is the power to do nothing. That's a force that Meghan Markle has perpetually been contending with. The moment her relationship with Prince Harry was revealed, Meghan was no stranger to the media's prying eyes. The press was both her stage and her battlefield. The reporting was never-ending, intense and extremely invasive. It evolved over time into something more complicated than simply a love-hate relationship in Hollywood. Meghan had known media scrutiny before, but not like this. As an actress on a hit-ish TV show, she was recognizable but not constantly hounded. The paparazzi rarely hung around her home and her interviews were carefully controlled, if at all, usually done in connection with a program or a charity. In this sphere, the media connections were a matter of negotiation. A journalist will trade a positive coverage piece for an exclusive look into personal details. There was an unspoken contract, quid pro quo. Nonetheless, the royal estate system worked quite differently. When Meghan stepped on the stage, the stakes rose. Her private life was no longer her own. It was public domain, picked apart in tabloids, dissected on television, argued about on social platforms. Everything she wore was analyzed and interpreted and injected with meaning, whether true or not, and everything she said and did and tweeted was taken out of context, twisted, made the worst possible version of itself. The unique British tabloid culture was eye-opening. Faster, fiercer and far less forgiving than its US equivalent on British turf. Stories were generated out of nothing overnight on rumor and a whisper. Palace insiders, who would only speak under anonymity, became regular headline fodder where their supposed comments would shape Meghan's image, whether positive or negative. The pendulum swings were disorienting. At first, coverage of Meghan had an air of fairy tale about it. The narrative was irresistible, a scrappy, self-made, biracial, divorced actress from Los Angeles, paving her way with a career that would be nothing short of dazzling, suddenly marrying into one of the most traditional and isolated institutions on earth. Her arrival was perceived as a step in the right direction, and brought positive reaction in the press as she was hailed as a new generation of royalty. But the honeymoon didn't last long. Months after their wedding, the tenor of the stories started to change. Questions about her treatment of other staffers began to surface. Gossips about strife with Catherine, the Princess of Wales, started to appear in the tabloids. Royal sources speaking on the condition of anonymity claimed that she was aggressive and difficult, with criticisms of her expanding beyond the professional. Attacks on her personally included her background, her direct American style, and even the way she moved. It was also at this time that Meghan began to break away from the royal media strategy. When met with negativity, the dominant posture in the palace was silence. The idea was that by not granting respectability to false reports, the stories would eventually go away. But Meghan brought a different sensibility. In Hollywood, staying quiet might as well be an admission, and controlling the message meant responding immediately and forcefully to things you wish would go away. Meghan's instinct had been to ignore damaging narratives. Reportedly, in her circle of public relations advisors, some suggested a not-so-submissive approach that included engaging with sympathetic journalists on social media and providing counter-narratives in the media, the report said. Meghan was not waging an act of aggression against the media in deploying it as a tool to defend herself, it was self-preservation against the establishment. However, such a tactic came with dangers. If the treasure hunter didn't deliver, there might be retaliations. If a royal or someone close to them was found to be leaking stories or providing briefings, the control of the palace over the wider narrative would be at risk. And further complicating matters was the all-too justified suspicion that Meghan already was part of some secret media op. Astute reporters began to notice patterns. Coverage that was favorable to Meghan appeared alongside negative reports about other royals in some publications. The hint in some circles was that the information was flowing two ways. This framework therefore places a premium on Elton John's intermediary services within the complex ecosystem of royal media relations. Outside the palace walls, allies could function as off-the-books ambassadors for a royal, people who could champion a royal's cause without the personal connection that might make a fuss in the public realm. It does seem Meghan caught on to that idea, on a conscious or subconscious level. Even if she couldn't contrive a story herself without consequence, others could do it for her. Her relationship with the media was also tangled up with court action. It emerged 2019 that Meghan and Harry had launched legal proceedings against a major British tabloid over the publication of a private letter the Duchess wrote to her father. It was a rare and forceful move for members of the royal family, who have generally avoided legal battles with the media except when absolutely necessary. The lawsuit was a high-stakes moment, with advocates hailing her as brave but detractors calling her a hypocrite, saying that she wanted to be in the public eye one day and have privacy the next. The court fight has cast a fresh spotlight on Meghan's belief in her own power to take on the media as a rival to be faced head-on, even as it has also exposed the dangers of that approach. Details of her private communications, some in apparent contradiction with her past public statements, came into sharper relief through court records and testimony. This gave the press an opening to depict her as cynically exploiting her supporters, and revealed the endless intrusiveness of the press. In this context, Meghan's supposed pleas to Elton were part of her larger plan to engage the press, not a moment of irrational anger. Meghan did not see the press as a monolith, but rather as a weapon that could be deployed for good or ill. The secret was always in using it and not getting caught using it. The other key claim central to Meghan's world was independence in telling her own story, an idea that flew in the face of the palace's slow, controlling style of communication, which she and Harry thought required rapid and selective reaction. With the palace calling for restraint, Meghan seemingly took it upon herself to forge her own communication channels and wield influence. Because of his credibility and connections, Elton was one such way. For all Meghan's calculation, her relationship with the media was a hall of mirrors of paradox. She craved privacy but sought the spotlight for her efforts. Though she decried the intrusion of the press, she exploited big primetime interviews to put her case to her enemies, a paradox her supporters took as proof of deception. It was a practical adaptation to a hostile environment. For Elton, watching Meg walk herself through the issue was an analysis of expertise and danger. He could see the moments when her media instinct, inflicting public empathy, redeemed or molded an agenda to her purpose. He could also see the missteps, the moments when resistance only fueled the story or when an attempt to direct the story led to new vulnerabilities. The collision of Meghan's media strategy and the royal family's public relations operation was never going to be smooth. One bet on patient tradition and long-term positioning, the other on speed, forthrightness, immediate impact. In the middle of this battle, people like Elton stood, holding on to both worlds yet belonging to neither. The desperate call he received purportedly from Meghan was, in so many ways, the natural endpoint of her approach to the press. If the palace wasn't going to look out for her in the way that she wanted, and if engaging directly with the press was too potentially damaging, then the answer was to find go-betweens, people who would say what they needed to loud enough to be heard but without the actual connection back to her being official in nature. Elton's refusal of her request wasn't a condemnation of her strategy in general. He understood why she fought her battles the way she did, but he also knew something that years in the public eye had taught him. Media control is always temporary. The story you spin now to protect yourself may be the headline that haunts you later. In Meghan's unrelenting war with the press, victories were fleeting, and losses loomed large. The media was not to be conquered as a battlefront but simply withstood as a tempest, never truly conquered. Elton thought that sometimes it was the best course to run right out of the storm, though, to save someone else, you had to leave others to fight their own fight. In later discussion of the alleged request with Meghan Markle, one aspect which was interesting and controversial was that she apparently had some specific members of the royal family in mind. This was no mere recasting of public perception or effort to set the record straight. Elton explained the ask in detail, saying it was very targeted and a red rag to a bull for people whose public profile clashed with Meghan's and her influence within the closed monarchy system. Each senior royal has his or her role to play in the national imagination. Some evoke the past, some the future. Some of them are universally celebrated, while others are steeped in controversy. To understand the supposed logic of targeting, one has to understand the hierarchy as not only a lineage, but as a narrative power structure. It is a high level, probably those at the top who would be the first potential targets. This can begin to create a rivalry with any siblings, when one sibling starts to receive all of the public's adoration and grows to become almost universally showered as the favorite. In the royal family, it's a love that translates into a considerable amount of sway. It allows one to influence opinions, capture charitable attention, and personify the institution itself in a way that others have to try to emulate. And after Meghan married Harry, the standout couple of the royal family remained Prince William and the Princess of Wales, Catherine. They projected an elegant but also friendly formality. But Catherine, especially, projected an aforementioned outward image of propriety, poise, and non-scandal, a good look for the palace who supposedly also view this as an integral element of their brand of storytelling. For Meghan, who endured a great deal of scrutiny and occasional criticism, Catherine's squeaky clean image may have appeared nearly impossible to achieve. While Elton never referred directly to the Duke or Duchess of Cambridge in relation to Meghan's alleged demands, he made it clear he was talking about senior members of the royal family, whose reputations were protected when, in Meghan's mind, she and Harry faced a barrage of negative media coverage. If this is indeed the case, it implies that the stories Meghan is supposed to have wanted to leak are more than likely about said moments or actions that less than perfect people don't want you to know about. The second category to be targeted could be of lesser proximity to the throne, but with internal influence within the family. Dynamic members of the royal family who had the Queen's trust, or were popular with the public, could be discreet counterweights to Meghan behind the scenes. If they dared to criticize Meghan, and particularly if they had questions about how her actions were affecting the family's reputation, those negative views could kill two birds with one stone, protecting her from any uncomfortable examination on the inside and ensuring discussions on the outside remained focused elsewhere. For this section, you will have heard a few off-the-cuff references to Princess Anne by some of the observers and commentators who are blunt and unsentimental about the realities of royal or imperial life. With decades of loyal service and a reputation of hard work, Princess Anne was respected by the Queen and by the public. Although there was no evidence that Meghan thought of her as a rival, there were reports of tensions between Meghan and some of the more senior royals due to differences of opinion about protocol and the speed at which royal duties were absorbed. The third tier of potential targets would have been people already in the public eye, personalities with existing cracks in their reputational armor that could be broken further with purposeful efforts. And in those cases, the objective wasn't to write new stories, but rather cover up old ones in a way that was shiny and distracting enough. For example, Meghan and Harry might have decided to zero in on Prince Andrew, who was already facing withering public criticism for his association with Jeffrey Epstein. It may not have required Meghan to cook up lurid tales at all. Why not just boost the ones that are already circulating and divert some attention on the media hurricane from one story to another? And the plan had relatively little downside risk for Meghan, after all, as Prince Andrew was already generating front-page headlines. Elton felt the palace was controlling Prince Andrew's public persona separate from the rest of the royal family. It was the specificity not just of the identification of individuals but the exactitude of the request. The tactic of leaking stories in the entertainment business usually comes with a ragtag style, a smattering of truths and half-truths and exaggerations sowed far and wide with the hope that some of that manure grows. In the realm of royalty, accuracy makes intentions plain. When specific individuals are attacked with personalized stories, the practice turns from spin control to a knife in the side. Elton also knew that the consequences of such anecdotes would not limit themselves to reputational damage. Each time a negative story appeared about a member of the royal family, it prompted doubts about the solidity of the institution. Public fights, whether admitted or denied, stripped the monarchy of any ability to present a united face when its relevance was already under scrutiny. In modern Britain, internal divisions fought out in the media could be hugely damaging. If Meghan had come to believe that the palace was involved in such negative stories about her, it's possible she felt that she was only getting her own back. Elton understood the difference between reacting to being treated unfairly and responding to conflict that has already been set in motion. Once ignited, there was no containing such escalation. He'd seen this movie play out once before, with Diana and Charles, and the controlled leaks turning into tabloid war, every side certain it would be supreme, while the institution itself collapsed the building. What made this scenario especially precarious was that Elton would assume if he accepted the supposed, if not accurate, open position given his reputation for unbridled loyalty to the royal family. Whatever story he did churn out would stick, thought to be legitimate, not just tittle-tattle, cut and checked through the prism of his years of devotion to Diana and her sons. His name gave even deeper meaning to the blow. That was not an insignificant part of the moral responsibility on his shoulders as he considered Meghan's request. And though he could understand the sense of what she was suggesting, he could also see where it would take him. If the public became used to hearing unsavory reports about senior royals from credible sources, the floodgates would open for more secrets. Once opened, the floodgates could not be closed. Even more troubling to him was the potential for press divisions to spark a broader investigation into every royal relationship. Journalists feed on conflict, and even a whiff of dissent among such major players as William, Catherine, Harry and Meghan could mean weeks of fevered coverage. Every public appearance would be dissected for signs of strain. Any little move would be seen to confirm this alleged split. Elton saw the irony that, in trying to defend her reputation, Meghan could end up further damaging it. If the media had the impression that she had anything to do with the negative press surrounding other royals, it only would further the narrative that, again, she demanded to be a manipulator and a snake. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more shocking royal revelations. Your support keeps us uncovering the truth behind the palace walls.